Okay, welcome back. Now we're going to start turning to a completely different topic, the deontological philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And this really brings us into the modern period in philosophy. Aristotle was in the ancient period. He was alive and writing about 400 years or 300 between 380 to 400 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. So a very long time ago. Immanuel Kant is writing at the end of the 18th century, so the 1780s and 90s is when he's publishing his work on moral philosophy. So that's quite a big jump from 400 years before the birth of Jesus to 1790 years after the birth of Jesus. A lot has happened in that period, and a lot of that has to do with what happens to the views of Aristotle and Plato in the medieval period as they get interpreted by the Catholic Church and by Islam. So we're skipping all of that stuff and fast forwarding to the Enlightenment in the 18th century / the beginning of the 19th century. Okay, so now you may recall from earlier in these lectures that I mentioned that there was a split between ancient ethical theories and modern ethical theories over what the foundational question of ethics is. Is it what makes a person good, or is it what makes an action good? And it's this second question that Kant's moral theory is interested in addressing. So Kant is interested in the question, what makes an action good? And he's going to then tell us what a good person is in terms of possessing the thing that makes actions good. So remember, these two questions are related to each other. The only issue is which one is more primary, which one comes first. So now Kant gives an argument that what makes an action good is not its consequences, but is rather the motivation or intention of the person who's acting. And in particular, it's only one kind of motivation that matters for Kant. That's being motivated by one's moral duties. Now, we're not going to, at this point, we're going to get into this a lot in a bit, but at this point, I'm not going to say what a moral duty is, but it's at least important that we say at this stage that you recognize that this is moral duty. It's not just any duty. So Boy Scouts have duties, but they don't often have moral duties, at least not as members of that club. So we mean something very particular by one's actions being motivated by a moral duty, and we'll come back to that. Okay, so the basic thing here that Kant argues for is that there's something that he calls the good will. And the goodwill is the thing which is intrinsically valuable on Kant's view. So what is the will? Well, the will is just that thing which chooses to do something. And we've talked already about the issue of will and whether it's free or not, whether your choices are determined. Or whether you have some kind of a non-deterministic control, non-determined control over your actions. So that's the same thing that he's talking about here. A good person for Kant is one who possesses the good will, and the good will is having this kind of motivation that we previously spoke about. So a good action is defined as one that's motivated by one's moral duties, and a good person is one who has the goodwill. The goodwill being the thing which is determined by duty. So we all have choices to make in our day-to-day lives, and the good person is the one whose choices are determined or causally produced by one's moral duties. Now, that's all very quick, but that's the basic of Kant's view, and if you can understand that, you will go a long way towards understanding what his actual theory is. So I don't expect that you understand it right now, but keep that in mind, that a good person is one whose actions are produced by an explicit recognition of their moral duties. Now, Kant rejects happiness and virtues as intrinsically good, or in other words, the things that Aristotle postulated as intrinsically good. Kant rejects them because, for instance, the virtues aren't themselves intrinsically good, because whether they're good or not depends on who possesses them. So an evil person can be courageous. And as the book points out, someone who's truly evil but who possesses the virtues of wit and intelligence is much more of a destructive force than someone who doesn't possess those virtues. So Kant thinks, well, no, depending on who has the virtues, they're good or bad. So they're not bad in and of themselves, or good in and of themselves, excuse me. Now, even happiness, which Aristotle thought was the intrinsic good, happiness can lead to laziness or sloth, could lead to pride and presumption. So to sort of appreciate Kant's point here, think about the kind of life that Aristotle recommends that we pursue. Well, you have a family, you make good money, you have time to enjoy the finer things of life, discuss philosophy, have a respected in the community, etc., etc. But of course, oftentimes what happens to people is they become, well, less zealous, less apt to do those kinds of virtuous behaviors, and they kind of get lax. So you can think of the success arc of a celebrity. When they're first come on, they're working very hard to achieve the things that they want. They get to that stage, and then they become the kind of fat, bloated mess where they become lazy, even maybe arrogant, and somewhat of a quote-unquote diva, even if it's a male, and etc. So if the person's will, that is, if they're not constantly making the right kinds of choices, if the person's will isn't good, then these things, happiness and the virtues, can lead to bad things. So whether they're valuable depends not on themselves, says Kant, but on the will of the person. That is, a slogan way of putting this that Kant often did talk like this, actually. A slogany way of putting it is that, look, you have to deserve happiness. So those with the good will deserve happiness, and those with who have bad wills, they may have that kind of life, but we wouldn't want to say that they're good people if they're doing things for the wrong reason, or at least that's what Kant thinks. And the basic argument that he gives here is sort of a thought experiment about a rational, disinterested spectator. And so we're going to come back to that in a second, but he says that in the passage in the book. If some rational, disinterested spectator were looking down at the world, the goodwill would shine like a jewel. Now that's a provocative metaphor, and we're going to come back to it later in these lectures. But for now, let's talk a little bit more about duty. So I mentioned that Kant's kind of theory is what's called deontological, and that's because the Greek word here, deontos, means duty or obligation, and so a deontological theory is one that has duty as the central notion, and it's a moral theory that's concerned with discovering what the duties of people are and on what foundation they rest. Now, as I was careful to point out earlier, not just any duty will do here. So it's got to be something that's produced, this is Kant's view, the moral duties are those things which are produced by some kind of law which is necessary and universal and covers all persons at all times. So Kant really is an absolutist, so he thinks that there is something called the moral law, which is a law which governs the universe, just like any other law. And when he says law like any other, what he means is like a law of logic of the sort that we find as the foundation of logic, like that of the law of non-contradiction, which claims that no contradictions can be true. These are fundamental claims made on rational persons. And Kant's idea, the thing that we're going to try to unpack over the next couple of weeks, is to get at this idea that it's really this sense of rationality which is the foundation for morality. And when he means rationality, he literally means this business about contradiction. So we're going to talk more about what it means to be inconsistent and to for imagined scenarios to be contradictory in nature. The upshot of all this is that Kant thinks that the moral laws can be discovered by reasoning about possible scenarios and discovering what's contradictory or not in those scenarios, thereby arriving at necessary and universal moral principles which are true for all people across all times. So a very different kind of approach than the one that Aristotle was interested in. And Kant, as we were talking about just a second ago, Kant was very unhappy with Aristotle's view because ultimately Aristotle's moral theory boils down to the claim that you should do the right thing at the right time for the right reasons in the right way. And Kant is here seen as suggesting that this is very unsatisfying because we don't know what the right time is, what the right way is. We don't know any of that, but that's exactly what we need to know. Now, Aristotle says, practice and get in there and get your hands dirty and figure it out. But Kant wants ethics to be a science like logic or mathematics that we can work out just by reasoning without appeal to individual experiences. Now, this again sounds all very complicated, and in a sense it is complicated, but I'm just trying to paint a picture of what it's going to look like at the end. We're going to explain this in a lot more detail. So just to illustrate this, suppose that you have a duty to be honest. Kant does indeed think that truth-telling is one of our duties, and the book talks a little bit about why he thinks that. We'll come back to that. So now, suppose that there are these two people, right? And this is one of Kant's favorite examples. He says, suppose that there are these two different persons, each of them who owns some local bodega. So one of the bodega's owners is an honest businessman. He's honest, though, because he realizes that being honest is good for his business. So he sort of reasons as follows. Well, you see, if I overcharge people or charge one person one price and another person another price, then people will find out about this and they will, in effect, not come back because they know I'll rip them off. So the best way to keep my business going is for me to be honest. Now, this should, by the way, this description of this person should ring some bells for you. You should be thinking in your mind, aha, this person is an, if you heard the word egoist in your mind, then yes, or if you said it, then you were right. Kant's here describing the egoist view, right? So he's sort of targeting egoism here. So that's the way the egoist would describe why a person should be honest. Now, suppose that this other person, it also owns a bodega in a different neighborhood, let's say, and this person is also an honest businessman, charging fair prices, charging consistent prices, and so on. But suppose that this person is honest not because they think it's going to help their business, although that's a welcome byproduct of this, but suppose that they're honest because they sort of recognize that they have a duty to be honest. So what if this person thinks to themselves, I own this shop, and being honest is an important moral duty, and so in my dealings with my customers, I've got to be honest and fair and make sure that they get quality products and that they're charged a fair price and that this is consistent over time. Now, According to Kant, only the second person's action has any moral value. The other person is acting selfishly, Kant thinks, and their action has no moral value at all. They do not count as performing a good action. See, this follows from Kant's our definition of what a good action is. A good action is one that's motivated in the right way, namely by a recognition of one's duties, and in particular one's moral duties. So the first person, although their action from the outside appears to be moral, isn't. They're faking it. They're not acting for the right reasons, Kant thinks, and therefore don't count as doing anything morally good. Now, again, why does he think this? Well, think about a completely rational, disinterested spectator. So imagine that you were a godlike character who's not interested in either of these persons or their lives. You know, you're sort of watching this on a TV show, or, you know, from some omniscient point of view, like in a movie. So you see one person being honest, but only because it benefits them, and you see that if they could get away with it, if it benefited them in some other way, that without being honest, that they would. But it just so happens that this is the conclusion they've come to. There's no other way to get the things that they want. And then you see the other person who's being honest because they recognize that they should be honest. And that's what duties are encoded in these things, that we should do, that we ought to do. So this person is reasoning that they ought to keep their obligation, so they are. Now, this disinterested spectator, which one is going to be the person whom is judged by this spectator to be doing the moral thing? Well, Kant feels very strongly that this rational, disinterested spectator is going to be pleased with the person who's acting because of their duties, and he's going to be sort of turning his nose up at this other person. It's sort of obvious, Kant thinks, that, well, you can see this guy's faking it and this guy's doing something morally good. Now, not everyone agrees with Kant, but that's the argument that he gives, that this rational, disinterested spectator would be interested, who could tell the difference, would judge one of these to be moral and the other one to be immoral. This is the only thing, according to Kant, which determines whether or not an action is a good action, or whether it was motivated by, This is the only thing that determines whether an action is a good action, and that's whether it's motivated by a recognition of a moral duty. So to oversimplify a bit, Kant thinks that there are really only two kinds of motivations. There are the ones that are explicit recognition of one's duties, and then there are the selfish ones. Now, this includes, for instance, according to Kant, those people who are motivated to help others because it makes them feel good. And remember, this is something we've talked about. So Kant is here sort of responding to the various views that have come before him. Remember, he's writing in the 1790s, so there's been 2,000 years of discussion about ethics, and all the stuff that we've been talking about has been happening in that period. So there's been Aristotle's view. Hobbes was in the 1600s, so 150 years before Kant. People are talking about egoism, social contract theory, and that's basically part of the story that Kant's telling here. So the basic point that he wants to make against people who think that helping people and it producing a feeling in you is okay, and that was Rachel's argument. That's what I sort of lost my train of thought earlier, but that was the point I was trying to make, is all the people we've been discussing so far have been in the past, before Kant, except James Rachel's, who is a more contemporary figure. But even so, we can see Kant as, in effect, responding to the kinds of considerations that Rachel brings up. So remember, the egoist says, look, you're selfish because you want to help someone, and it produces this feeling in you, this feeling of pleasure. And so all you're trying to do is pursue that feeling of pleasure. It makes you feel good, and so therefore that action is selfish. Now Rachel's responds to this argument, yeah, but it's not really selfish. It doesn't really make sense to call it selfish, because what makes me feel good is helping other people. And it seems weird to call someone selfish who's helping other people. So you might think that Rachel's argument responds to Kant. But Kant's making a slightly different point here, and that's the arbitrariness of these inclinations or feelings. So, for instance, it might make you feel good to help other people. But that's accidental. What if it hadn't turned out that way? What if you didn't feel good helping other people? Then you wouldn't have any reason to do it? Kant says no, actually you would still have reason to do it. And if that's true, then the fact that you feel good as a result or as a result is accidental. And in fact, Kant often talks this way, that real moral actions are the ones that, well, I don't want to put this too strongly, but he often talks as though we can see what he's talking about in cases where we have duties that conflict very strongly with what our inclinations tell us to do. So he says, look, imagine someone who just doesn't care about other people because of their dispositional character. They just, they're not moved by the plight of the homeless person as they walk by them on the street. They see the person perhaps, shivering there with a sign that says, homeless vet, please help. And this person just isn't moved by that. But this person may recognize they have a duty to help others if they can, and they might say, okay, well, I have a duty to help you. Let me buy you a sandwich or something. I have a couple of extra dollars. I can afford that. So here's a person who doesn't want to help this person. It doesn't give them any satisfaction. It doesn't give them any joy. In fact, it might cause them some kind of pain. Helping them, they might think, God, why do I have to do this? Well, why? Is because they recognize that they have a duty to do it. Now, Kant doesn't think that that's required in order to make helping people or performing any of one's duties moral. But it certainly illustrates this distinction that he's trying to make here, which is that it's one thing to fill the pool of a duty. It's another thing to get pleasure from doing that. So it may be the case that most people, hopefully all, but clearly not, but maybe most, people feel good about themselves after helping other people, after telling the truth, after doing the various things that they ought to do. That's a wonderful thing, and Kant doesn't deny that you can't feel good about yourself after you perform your duties. That's fine. But he thinks that that's sort of an arbitrary, accidental fact about us, and if it were different, if you didn't feel good, in fact, even if it produced in you a sense of dissatisfaction, you would still have these obligations. And you can still see in key instances the pull of an obligation one way and an inclination in the other way. And we can really see, Kant thinks, something that's going to be essential for him. The exercise of free, rational control over our actions in the cases where we choose to perform our duty even though we're not inclined to or don't want to. Even if it doesn't make us feel good, we may nonetheless feel this pull to the duty. And that pull inspires, that the force of that pull from the inside, from the recognition that one has this duty, is what prompts Kant to say it fills him with ever-increasing awe. In fact, as much awe as staring up into the heavens above. He's just awestruck by the power that moral commands seem to have over people. If someone really recognizes that they have a duty, it can pull them. It can override everything else has this amazing power. And that's what Kant's talking about when he's talking about being motivated by the recognition of one's duties. Now, just to be very, very clear about this, you can derive pleasure from good action. That is perfectly fine. In fact, it's part and parcel of doing this. So, in his less theoretical account of ethics, Kant talks about how pleasure is going to be a byproduct of performing one's duty in most cases. It's the only claim that he wants to make is that pleasure can't be the reason that you're doing it. Because then you're doing it for the wrong reason. So consider these two scenarios to illustrate and sum up all of these things here. Suppose that I see a person struggling across the street. Suppose that I recognize a duty to help them, saying to myself, aha, I ought to help other people when I'm able, and I could easily carry that bag for that lady across this treacherous street. Let me assist her in compulsion with my moral duties. So I spring to her assistance. But of course, she's not expecting me to help her in these days and times. Rarely do people honor their duties with such enthusiasm as I am in this instance. And she tries to fight me off, and in the ensuing fight, she falls over and breaks her hip. Well, is my action in this case a moral action? Kant thinks, yeah, he does. He says, you were motivated in the right way. You felt the compulsion of duty. It motivated your action. It's not your fault, so to speak, that the consequences of the action are unfortunate. You can't be to blame for that. Your action was nonetheless a good action. So that's what I was just saying here. And in general, this is a theme of this section of Kant's argumentation. So, and this is going to be important later when we start to look at the utilitarians who think that the consequences do matter for an action. Kant's here making the argument that the consequences don't matter, that the only thing that matters is the motivation of one's action. Even if the consequences are bad, you still count as doing something good. And one large part of his argument is this central idea of his that the consequences of one's actions are out of one's control. So once you act, once it's out there, you don't know how things are going to go. They quickly become out of your reach, so to speak. So you say something, you do something, then this happens, and that happens, and that happens, and this happens, and very quickly it's no longer you who are in charge of what's going on. And Kant thinks that it's just sort of very, very odd that you could perform an action that's good or bad, but that isn't determined by something that is in you. That just seems very strange to him. And this is in general, I mean, think about this. It's something we'll talk about later, but just quickly, suppose that, you go to, you see a car coming and there's a person there and you push them out of the way, saving their life. You think that's good consequences, so that's a good action. Well, then what if this person was a mass murderer? So you just saved a mass murderer. They go on to kill their next victim. So now it's a bad action. Oh, but then you find out that their next victim was a person who had a nuclear device who was going to destroy New York City. So you really saved millions of people. So now it's a good action again. None of these things seem to be in your control. All that matters, or all that can really matter from your point of view, is why you do what you do. That's all you can really control. And if we're sort of judging whether you're good, seems like it should be because of something about you that makes you a good person and that makes your actions good actions. Consequences aren't in that arena. Now, of course, the utilitarians disagree, and we'll come to their arguments later towards the end of the semester. But just for now, this will be important for then, by the way, so you can come back to this point after our discussion of utilitarianism, and this will make a bit more sense. Okay, now, just to continue illustrating this point, Suppose I see the same person. Okay, so suppose this elderly lady is crossing the street, hands full of packages. Now, earlier, remember, I intended to help her out of a recognition of my duty to help. Suppose instead, this time, something different. I intend to cause her harm. I think to myself, aha, look at this old bat over here walking across the street. I'm going to have me a bit of fun, don't you know? And I'm going to run over there and push her over into the street. It's going to be hilarious. Her bags will go flying everywhere. She'll yelp in surprise, break her hip. Oh, it's going to be great fun. Now, suppose that in so doing, I accidentally, without meaning to, push her out of the way of an oncoming bus, saving her life. Did what I do count as morally good? Well, the consequences seem overall good. But Kant says my action itself, considered all by itself, chopping the consequences off, my action doesn't seem like a morally good action because I wasn't motivated in the right way. I intended to do harm. The good that resulted was accidental. I was merely trying to produce a certain feeling in myself, pleasure. That's what I was aiming for. And that I accidentally produced something desirable instead of undesirable is merely an accident of the universe. Now again, it doesn't seem like we should say that this person's action was good, Kant thinks, because if you just think about this person, they're not a good person. They're not doing something good. Sure, the consequences of it are good, but the action itself is not good. And this, again, you may disagree with Kant, and lots of people do. That's why the utilitarian theory of morality is going to be discussed next, because enough people disagree with Kant to think that it's worth trying to give a theory in more detail of what about consequences matter. So we'll turn to that later, but whether you agree with that or not, the point here is that for Kant, the consequences of an action are completely irrelevant to determining whether or not the action is moral. Now, of course, when I say completely irrelevant, we're gonna have to qualify that later, because thinking about consequences of actions do get to play some small role, but very, 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 very small. So we'll talk about that later. So again, just to stress, the only thing that matters for Kant is whether one is acting out of a recognition of one's duties. Okay, now of course, the question that you've probably had already by now is what are these duties? That's what's interesting. That's what we want to know. Sure, we can say, we have certain duties and so on, but what are they? Now, generally speaking, Kant says, duties are the kinds of things which are generated by laws. So, for instance, think about the laws of the state. Now, these aren't moral laws, they're legal laws, or in other words, they may in some sense try to capture things that we think of as moral or immoral, but oftentimes they don't. So take just a sort of banal, ordinary, average law like the speed limit on the freeway, 55 miles an hour, 65 in some places. Okay, so take the speed limit as being 65. Why is it that? Is it because it's immoral to drive faster? Well, no, actually, it turns out it has to do with conserving gas and miles per gallon and that kind of issue. So in some countries, famously, the speed limits are different. So in Germany on the Autobahn, there is no speed limit. You can go as fast as you want. And people tell horror stories about how fast it is. But of course, Germans don't tell horror stories. They tell horror stories about how slow Americans are and how they mess everything else up. We're just not used to driving at those speeds. But to focus back in on the issue here, because of the law to drive 65 miles an hour, we who drive have a duty to obey the law issued by the state, punishable by fines for those who do not fulfill their duty. So now think about those who drive on the highways. There are two ways of thinking about these people. There are those who drive the speed limit, if they do, because they are afraid of getting a ticket. These people, according to Kant, are not acting out of respect for the law, but are acting out of fear of the consequences of not following the law. That's very different. Now, there can be those kinds of persons who drive the speed limit because they recognize that they ought to. Now, I've never met such a person, but you can imagine somebody saying, well, the law says you drive 65, and I ought to obey the law. That's the law. Now, it doesn't seem as important with issues about the speed, but the point here is the one that's important. When you have laws, there are the kinds of people who respect those laws and whose actions are guided by the laws themselves because of a recognition of the nature of the law. And then there are those who obey the laws not because they care about the law, but only because of the consequences associated with violating the laws. Getting rewarded for following and punished for violating them. Now, as I was just mentioning, the speed limit doesn't seem to be a particularly moral issue, and the laws which govern it don't seem to be particularly moral laws. But the ones that Kant is interested in are the moral duties. And since every duty is generated by some kind of law, the moral duties are going to be generated by moral laws. But of course, the obvious question here is, what is this moral law that we're talking about? Well, in general, Kant thinks there are two kinds of laws. And so what he wants to do is to talk about the two different kinds of laws that there are, the types that there are, to generally identify what type of law the moral law would have to be if there were one. And then he's going to try to deduce the actual moral law just from the concepts of rational agency. It's quite a feat to behold, actually, whether you agree with it or not. So what follows is a multi-step argument, and we're going to go through it, hopefully quite cautiously, so you can see the various steps. So there are basically two kinds of imperatives. Now, an imperative is just a fancy way of talking about a command. So an imperative in particular is a command to act in accordance with some law. So you may have heard this expression. It's imperative that you be there. It means it's important in some sense, but that it's commanded. It's commanded, right? So we're going to be talking about imperatives and the kinds of imperatives that there are. And they get fancy names for Kant. So there's what he calls a hypothetical imperative, and there's what he calls a categorical imperative. A hypothetical imperative commands under the hypothesis that one wants something. So we can use some terminology at this point. The thing that you want is the end, and the way that you get that is the means. So here, hypothetical imperative has the form, if you want Y, then do X. And we can say that Y is the end and X is the means. Now, what is the point of this? Well, let's give a common sense example. So this doesn't make as much sense in an online class, but these slides weren't prepared for that, apparently. So if I told you you should not miss more than 5 of these classes, well, you might think, well, why shouldn't I miss more than 5 of these classes? Well, it's hypothetically, if you wanted to pass this class, then you would have some reason to obey this command. If not, than not. So if you don't care about passing the class, then this command has no effect on you. And sometimes I meet students like this. I say, here are the requirements. And then they don't meet those requirements, but they still come to the class because they're interested in the topic. They're less interested in passing it. They think they're going to have to take it again anyway, so this is good studying for them. It'll be good for them to get it or something like that. But so then they can miss as much class as they want if they don't care about passing it. Now, of course, hopefully you can sort of see to yourself, if you understand what a hypothetical command is, why Kant thinks that it can't be the kind of command that morality is interested in, because whether one obeys these commands depends only on the end that you happen to desire. So, for instance, if you say to one, if you want to be happy, then you must act virtuously or morally, as Aristotle was fond of saying. Well, someone who says, or at least thinks, that they don't desire happiness has no reason to care about morality. So you may say, look, if you want to be a good person, then you should care about telling the truth. But what are you supposed to say to the person who says, I don't give a crap about being a good person? Suppose they simply say, I'm not interested in being a good person. Being a good person is something that the chumps tell you. They're trying to make you into a sucker, you see. I don't want to be a good person. Well, someone who says that suddenly has no reason to obey the rules of morality if they're merely hypothetical. If morality is merely a hypothetical, based on hypothetical imperatives, then they have no reason to obey the rules of morality, or to put it slightly differently, they can opt out of the rules of morality whenever they want to. Right? Take the ego as virgin. If you want to maximize your own self-interest, then be honest. Well, that's fine, since in most cases you do want to maximize your own self-interest, and so that gives you plenty of good reason to act honestly. But of course the problem here is that you can equally well endorse the claim if you want to maximize your self-interest in cases when you can get away with it. Don't be honest. And you can think to yourself, that's perfectly consistent. So the only reason you have then to follow the rule, be honest, is if it maximizes your self-interest. And so you can opt out of it at any time if it doesn't maximize your self-interest. And Kant just thinks that the moral rules aren't like that. That they're not the kinds of things that you can choose to follow if it pleases you, or not to follow if it doesn't please you. He thinks they're of a completely different kind of nature, namely that they're categorical in nature. So a categorical imperative is one that binds unconditionally, right? So hypothetical imperatives only matter to people who care about the ends that are postulated in the hypothetical situation. If you want this thing, then here's the way to get it. Categorical imperatives, on the other hand, have the form, simply do this. Whether or not you want something is not at issue here. One just has to obey the command, and that's what categorical means here. It means that they should be followed without exception or without qualification, and Kant thinks that only categorical imperatives could capture the moral law. They're the only things that if there were a moral law which produced the duties that we have, the law would have to be something categorical in nature, because Kant views morality as laws which are akin to those of mathematics and which can't admit of exceptions based on things that you want. So, for instance, if it's a moral law, let me put this in the right way. If the moral law determines that we have a duty to be honest, then in all cases, honesty is required, even if we don't want to be honest, even if it's inconvenient for us to be honest, even if it produces harm for us, it's nonetheless required. And the reason that he thinks this is because he thinks that moral rules are categorical in nature. They don't admit of exceptions in exactly the same way as mathematical statements don't admit of exceptions. So if it's true that 2 plus 2 is 4, then it's true in all cases, even in cases where it's inconvenient for you. Imagine you only had $3 and you brought up 2 items, each of which were $2. Suppose the cashier rang that up and said, it's $4, please. $2 plus $2, cha-ching, $4. Suppose you said, oh, but I only have $3. That's terribly inconvenient for me. I want these things and I don't have $4. So can't we just say that on this one occasion, 2 plus 2 is 3? That would be really convenient for me if we could do that. Well, of course, that's absurd, the cashier would respond. That's crazy talk. Who cares if it's inconvenient for you? 2 plus 2 is 4. You have this thing, it's $2. You have this thing, it's $2. So therefore it's $4. Either put one of these back or go away, silly person, but please don't ask me to change the fact that 2 plus 2 is 4. Well, the same thing is true for murdering, for instance. If the moral law determines that we have a duty not to murder, then it doesn't matter if murdering would be convenient for us or would help further our goals. If it's wrong, then it's wrong. The fact that it's convenient for you or inconvenient for you is, frankly, Kant thinks, irrelevant. So the moral law is binding, according to Kant, on all persons. It's just like the law of gravity, and just like you can't object as you're falling from a 14th floor window, wait, I don't like this, I don't want to be falling anymore. You can't object to that. You can't exempt yourself from the law of gravitation. Neither can you exempt yourself from the moral law, Kant thinks. Now, you may think it doesn't apply to you, but that, of course, is irrational, just like the person who thinks that the law of gravity or that mathematics don't apply to them is irrational. Kant thinks the moral law is there. It's universal in nature. Any rational being can verify for themselves that it's there and that it's true simply by reasoning in the appropriate way. Just like any person can sort of check for themselves that 2 plus 2 is 4 by reasoning about 2 and 2 and 4. I mean, basically, in shorthand, the process would be like this. How could it be anything besides 4? What would that even mean? Try to imagine a scenario where 2 plus 2 is not 4. You can't really imagine what that scenario would look like, how it would play out. So too, Kant thinks that if you're careful and you reason in the appropriate way, you can see certain things are required by morality that are necessary and universal and don't admit of exception. And now, what he's done so far is just to give an argument that if there were a moral law, it would have to be categorical in nature. That is, hypothetical imperatives are not interesting, they won't work, they depend on the inclination of the person. We've already done a lot of arguing trying to show that that's not good. We don't want moral rules to be the kinds of things that you can opt out of. We don't want it to be the case that we can say, yes, I know that generally speaking, torture is wrong, but I don't care about that right now. I need to torture this person in order to get the information that I need. Kant thinks that if torture is wrong, it's always wrong to torture, end of story. And there are no circumstances under which torture will become right. Okay, so, but we haven't yet done anything to say what the moral law is. We've just said, well, it will have to be of a form of a categorical imperative. Right? But what kind of imperative? What's the content? What does it command us to do? Well, Kant thinks that you've got to have something, the moral law, that is. There's got to be something which any rational creature could reflect on and see was something that required respect and that one should base one's actions on it. Now, a lot of people say things like, well, do unto others. That's sort of, if you reflect upon it, you would want people to treat you in certain ways, so you should treat them in certain ways. The basis for our moral views then should be that we want to be treated in certain ways, so therefore we're obliged to treat other people in certain ways. Now, of course, Kant thinks there's an important truth there. The golden rule is, of course, golden for a reason, but it doesn't capture all the truths about morality. And the book points out a couple of interesting ways that Kant thinks it doesn't capture all the rules of morality. For instance, duties to oneself. We'll talk more about that later. But here we can just note that it doesn't capture what seems intuitively right and what we ought to say to a person who doesn't share our basic views. So imagine again the uncaring person. They just don't care about other people. You say to them, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And this person thinks, well, I would have others do unto me this way. Leave me alone. Stay out of my business. Don't help me and I won't help you. Just piss off. Thank you very much. Now, of course, this person will then have a completely solid seeming justification for not helping other people or caring about the welfare of other people. So too, a person may think, do unto others. Well, I don't really care if people tell me the truth about stuff. Who cares? So I don't care if I wouldn't want someone to tell me I look fat in my jeans, so I'm going to not tell them they look fat in their jeans. And I wouldn't want someone to hurt my feelings by telling me they had cheated on me, so I'm not going to tell you I cheated on you, etc. Well, these clearly seem ridiculous. So, do unto others is not the kind of law which we can reflect on and then come to respect, because we see, well, sure, it's a good rule of thumb for people who already have the right kinds of inclinations. But what about the rest of them? It doesn't tell us what's the nature or what the reason for these morally valuable actions attaining that status, because it certainly can't simply be that I feel a certain way about them, because as we've seen ad nauseum, people feel all kinds of ways about these things. So what are we supposed to do then? Well, still, there's something about do unto others which is right, Kant thinks. Namely, it has you think about the way actions can be consistent or inconsistent. So he says, look, what we want here is some kind of general law. A law which, if a rational person reflected on it and really understood what it meant, they would say, aha, that's right. That's the kind of thing which in all these circumstances could produce an overwhelming feeling of awe and respect in the person who fully came to truly understand its nature. And do unto others doesn't do that. Now, it also has to be the kind of law which doesn't make reference to any particular character traits, since those can be good or bad depending on whether one is subject to the moral law. So we can't include those in the content of the moral law. It can't say, thou ought to be honest, thou ought to be brave. It's got to be something completely general, which we can use to generate our specific duties. And the only thing that can really command the respect of a rational person, Kant thinks, is the concept of a universally binding moral law. So it's only when you kind of go, oh, see, the moral law has to be something which every person could accept, has to be something which rational persons are really impressed by, something that they recognize just by reasoning that it's valuable and commands that you do these actions. Well, what kind of thing could do that? Well, a universally binding moral rule, a moral law. Well, let's formulate it this way then, Kant says. This is something that has to do with actions, but no particular actions, only the concept of action. So we don't include a particular action in there, but only the command that one ought so to act in such a way that one's actions could be done by all persons without contradiction. Or a bit more formally, act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal moral law. Now, you may not fully understand what that means, but Kant thinks if you do, if you reflect on it, then you'll see that this is the kind of rule which every person ought to obey, namely that their actions should be non-contradictory, non-self-contradictory. And the reasoning is really by analogy to the way we think about logic. So if you think about certain forms of reasoning in logic, for instance, if you think about the general pattern of reasoning, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal, which is exemplified symbolically by the form in syllogistic logic, all A's are B, S is an A, therefore S is a B. Now if you just sort of reason about that form, you can see, well, anything you put in then the place of A and B and S there, you're going to get something which is true and something which is truth preserving, something which if the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. All dogs are mammals, Frankie is a dog, so Frankie is a mammal, right? You can see, you can do this all day long, filling in the various A's, B's, and S's, and you're going to get something which you can go, yes, when I'm reasoning, I should follow this rule. This produces good patterns. Now, you can't give an argument for that. You just sort of have to reflect on it and see that, yes, it avoids contradiction. That's what's guiding me here. And in something like that, the categorical imperative, Kant thinks, when you reflect on it, on the rule, one sees that non-contradiction is guiding one's reasoning process here. And what one is doing then is thinking, look, if my proposed course of action were suddenly to become a law, like the law of physics or the laws of logic, everyone had to do this without choice, what would be the case? Would there be a contradiction in such a case? If there is a contradiction, then the action is immoral.